Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And yes, welcome from me to this webinar, Managing Money for Students, a Student's Guide to Money. So just to briefly introduce myself first, I'm Amy Staines, Senior Financial Education Manager at Better with Money. And Better with Money is an independent financial education company. And really our aim is to help bring money matters to life and hopefully in turn help to reduce any financial stress you might be feeling, as well as helping you to build upon your financial resilience. Now, just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. First of all, today's webinar is providing information only, so I won't be providing any sort of financial advice, but instead I'm hoping to give you the tools and the knowledge to help you take control of your money. And it's also important to note that Better with Money isn't connected to any of the companies or websites that I might mention today. And we also have no products to sell. So where I do mention companies, websites along the way, it's because we genuinely believe they offer really good services which you can take advantage of, and not because we have any sort of financial incentive to do so. So let's get started. And really, the aim of today's webinar is to help you better manage your personal finances as a student. So whether you're looking for ways to save money, you want some hints and tips as to where to start, or perhaps you're struggling financially, then this session really is for you, because we're going to cover budgeting, money saving tips. We're going to have a look at student accommodation and renting. We're going to cover student jobs, bank accounts, and then look at where you might be able to go to get some financial support. And before we get into the content, I do think it's important to just set the scene, because according to Save the Student, the average student's living costs are actually about £1,104 per month. And London students are spending a monthly average of £1,264. So these are really huge figures, and maintenance loans do often fall far short of covering these costs. And in fact, the average maintenance loan falls short by around £504 per month. So this just illustrates that it really is more important than ever to be savvy with money. And so that's what I'm hoping to help you with today. And I want to first talk about budgeting. And according to a recent student survey, around 1 in 6 students have never budgeted and they don't know where to start. So let's help with that first. And think about what a budget actually is. And a budget is quite simply a plan of the income you have coming in compared to the things you need to pay out each month. And you can complete a budget simply using a pen and paper. You could use an Excel spreadsheet. There are also more and more tools cropping up online to help you. And the Better with Money website does contain budgeting calculators as well. So please do go on there. You can access those for free under the employee resources section. But UCAS also has some really great budgeting tools and planners as well. But whatever tool you choose, you should think firstly about the money you have coming in. So where is this coming from? So are you receiving a maintenance loan? How often is this paid? Now, maintenance loans are usually paid at the start of each term. So this often means you will suddenly see a big chunk of money appear in your bank account at the beginning of term. So it's really, really important to budget properly to ensure that this lasts for the duration of the term. But aside from maintenance loans, perhaps you get money from part-time or holiday jobs, and we will talk about those more later. Perhaps you receive money from parents or carers or other family members. Benefits, for example. So really spend some time thinking about all the sources of income that you have access to. And then once you've done that, it's about thinking about your expenditure. So what is going out of your account every month? And it can help to split this into 3 different categories. So the first being essential expenditure. So this covers things like your accommodation, your bills, your food costs. The second pot is debt. So, for example, any phone finance or car finance, for example. And then there's the fun stuff. So that's going out with your friends, getting takeaways, buying clothes, things like that. And whilst you're doing this, also consider any costs that perhaps happen less frequently than monthly as well. So things like buying textbooks, or indeed any costs that happen once a year. So birthday presents, or if you've got a car, your car MOT. And once you know what your income and expenditure are, you can then calculate the difference between the two figures. And this should help you to identify whether you have a surplus or a shortfall. And if you have a shortfall, so that's where your expenditure is more than any income you're getting in, it's then about thinking whether there are any costs you can cut back on, or perhaps are there any opportunities to boost your income? And that's what we're going to move on to looking at now. So if we start by looking at some money saving tips, which might help. So, first of all, I think it's really important to be aware that in households where everyone is a full-time student, you don't pay council tax. So, to count as a full-time student, your course must last at least 1 year and involve at least 21 hours of study per week. But if you fulfill that criteria and you do get a bill, you can then apply for an exemption. Now, it's also worth knowing that you should remain exempt from council tax even on a placement year, provided the total time spent on that work placement doesn't exceed the combined periods of study. And also, if you're sharing a house with someone who isn't a student, then that non-student will be liable for council tax. So I've linked the gov.uk website on the slide, so definitely have a look on there to learn more. But if we move on to the next point, so whilst most medical and hospital treatment is free on the NHS, you may still have to pay for things like prescription medications, dental checkups, dental treatment, eye tests, glasses. However, some students are eligible for help with these costs as well, and that's on the grounds of low income, and that's via the NHS Low Income Scheme. Now, this help you get depends on your income, your outgoings, any savings or investments you have at the time you apply. But if you do want to apply, you should complete an HC1 form. And if you're successful, you will receive an HC2 certificate. And that's what provides those healthcare entitlements. And again, I've provided a link on the slide there. Now, the next point is all around course materials, because one of the big upfront costs of university can be textbooks. And the first thing I'd say on this is don't necessarily rush into buying them, because often lots of these resources are now available online, and you may find that you don't actually end up using the books as much as you think you might. But if you do need them, try secondhand book sales, join student Facebook groups, see if anyone's selling those textbooks for cheap. Buy earlier editions of textbooks, perhaps if they're acceptable. Look at getting books from the library as well. And there are also various online digital library sites, including Vital Source and Pelego. And these actually apparently can save up to 80% compared to buying those textbooks new. So various options there for kind of upfront costs associated with course materials. But if we next think about travel, student rail cards can massively help reduce costs of getting around by up to a third. So these include the 16 to 25 rail card. I've linked that on the slide. This costs £70 for 3 years, but does offer that third off all rail travel. There's also an 18 plus student Oyster photo card if you're travelling in London, and there's the young person's coach card as well. So worth looking into if you are doing a bit of travelling. But if we then move on to the final 2 points, as students, there are various options for you to access student discounts at businesses around the country. So first of all, there's the Totem card. This did replace the student's card, but you can opt for the free light version, as it's called, and this gives discounts in places like Pizza Express, ASOS, but then there's a full version as well. This does cost £14.99 for the year, but it does come with the added bonus of a verified proof of age ID card, which means actually you don't need to take your driving license or passport out with you when you are going out. And they will also give 6 months free for student Amazon Prime and discounts at places like Apple as well. So you can get a Totem card from age 16, so it might be worth looking into. But there are other student discount sites as well, places like Student Beans, Unidays, free to use, give again access to a range of ongoing discounts. You will need an active .ac.uk email address to sign up for those. But some ideas there, and the Save the Student website, which is linked at the bottom of the slide, does have lots more money saving tips and advice, from how to get cheap cinema tickets, cutting money on your food shop, on student bills as well. So well worth a look on there. But I'd now like to spend a few minutes looking at student accommodation and renting. And I think it's first worth looking at the different types of student accommodation you might come across. So the first one is university halls. So halls of residence owned by your university, they tend to be mostly reserved for first year students. Now, private halls also exist, so similar to normal halls, but not owned by the university. And there are various UK-wide chains of purpose-built student accommodation across the country. More and more of these are cropping up. But if you don't stay in halls, you may choose to rent a house or flat privately, either by yourself, perhaps shared with others. And this is perhaps more common for second and third year students, and may also suit you if you're a mature student as well. But when deciding what accommodation you want, it's really important to think about what you can realistically afford. So, thinking back to that budgeting exercise. And part of this will mean comparing the different types of accommodation and comparing prices in different areas as well. But you should always read and understand the agreement you're signing relating to any accommodation. Contract lengths are usually around 40 weeks, and in halls, you don't usually have to pay during the summer holidays, although you will through kind of Christmas and Easter breaks. Now, private rentals do often start in the summer, so you may actually be paying rent for additional months of the year with privately rented property. But as you can imagine, accommodation does come in a range of shapes and sizes, and therefore price does ranges. So university accommodation will probably be more expensive if you opt for extras, so food included, ensuite bathrooms, cleaners. And if you're looking at houses, you should also check if the rent and the rent covers bills as well, because that can impact the price. But whichever accommodation you choose, you may wish to make your rental payments via direct debit. So an automatic payment to make sure you don't miss any payments. And the same goes for your bills, because missing bills can actually negatively impact your credit score. So it's really important to get this right. And if you're in a shared accommodation and bills aren't included in your monthly rental cost, you might find it useful to use tools like Splitwise or Housemate to help with that bill splitting exercise between flatmates. But the final point I want to cover here is deposits, because deposits will usually be required when you move into student accommodation, whether that's university halls or privately rented accommodation. The amount of the deposit will vary depending on the type of accommodation, but it's usually returned at the end of the tenancy minus any costs for damages or outstanding rent payments. So it's really protection for the accommodation provider or landlord. But it is worth knowing that since April 2007, when renting in the private sector, your deposit actually has to be protected under the tenancy deposit scheme. So this means that a landlord or an agent who takes a deposit from a tenant must keep it in approved tenancy deposit schemes, and you as the tenant must be told which one. So do make sure you're aware of where that deposit is being held. And if you're in a shared house, you should also check with the agent or landlord if one deposit is to be paid or if it's actually one deposit per tenant. Now, I do appreciate that accommodation and renting and deposits can be quite overwhelming, particularly when you're in the midst of trying to find somewhere to live for the next academic year. So, in terms of where you can go for help and support, it is worth contacting your university's housing office. They can usually advise on and off campus accommodation, recommend local letting agents and landlords, generally those that have been verified by other students and meet certain standards as well. So definitely speak to your university's housing office for help and support. But let's now cover student jobs. So these can really help supplement your income and are also a really good opportunity to learn new skills and help boost that CV. Now, the first thing I'd say here is that it's really important to find the right balance, because you will need to be able to balance any paid work with your studies. And most course providers do recommend working no more than 15 hours per week. And it's for this reason that many people do choose to just work in the holidays, but others prefer and need more regular money coming in throughout the term. So in that case, it may help finding kind of flexible jobs that allow you to fit that work in around your course commitments. And jobs with flexible hours might include admin type roles, part-time roles in restaurants, bars, retail. You may be able to pick up jobs like market research, which can be done from home. And when thinking about student jobs, I think it's also important to touch upon tax because depending on how much you earn, you may need to pay income tax and national insurance on any part-time work whilst studying. So, as a rough rule of thumb, if your income exceeds the annual personal allowance threshold, so this is £12,570. So if you are earning more than £12,570, you'll become liable to pay income tax. And similarly, if your weekly earnings surpass £242, you will have to pay national insurance contributions. So the amount of tax you pay does depend on your income, and your employer will usually deduct these taxes from your wages automatically. This is through a system called Pay As You Earn, or PAYE. But it's worth having a look on the government website and perhaps using the government's tax calculator to get an estimate of how much tax you might pay. So I've linked the gov.uk website page, all about student jobs and paying tax on the slide. And another thing you may want to do is sign up for an HMRC government gateway account as well. So this is really like online banking, but for tax purposes, and it can really help you keep an eye on your tax affairs, make sure you're not paying too much tax or too little tax, and just helps you kind of really keep on top of that. But finally, on this slide, I've shared a few ideas of where you might find jobs. So the first being at the university itself via the student union or other jobs on campus. And actually, when I was at university, I worked for my department and I gave tours and supported at welcome days for prospective students. And actually, I got paid a really reasonable hourly rate. So great to supplement my maintenance loan at the time. So perhaps worth looking at. But other on-campus jobs include working in the eateries and bars, for example. But externally, Save the Student also contains some really great job ideas, and there are also dedicated student job sites as well. So places like Student Job and Employment for Students, or E4S. So worth just having a look on those. But now we've spoken about jobs, it's worth talking about bank accounts because you will, of course, need an account for any money you receive to be paid into. And the first thing that's important to consider is what you actually need from an account. So pretty much all current accounts come with a debit card, allow you to make and receive payments, move money, set up direct debits and standing orders. But other current accounts may have additional perks. So things like savings interest or cashback or free overseas spending. You may come across packaged bank accounts, which contain things like travel and mobile phone insurance. And it's also important to consider how you'd like to interact with the bank. So, would you prefer to use a fully digital service on an app? Would you prefer to be able to go in and speak to a person in branch? So, I've linked the Money Helper website here, which has some really useful information on choosing a bank account that's right for you. So, definitely worth having a look. But once you know what you're looking for, it's then time to shop around. And a particularly good place to look is the Save the Students site I've linked at the bottom. But do remember, this might not list every single bank account out there, so it might be worth looking on other comparison sites too. But you will probably come across student accounts. So accounts designed exclusively for university students may be something you wish to consider. You will usually need to prove your student status in order to open one of these, but they do often come with an interest-free overdraft. And this can be a really useful feature because having that interest-free overdraft means you hopefully won't end up paying high interest fees if you dip into it. It is important to keep an eye on it though, because if you were to exceed that agreed 0% overdraft limit, you will likely then start paying anywhere around 40% in interest, and this can soon add up. So still really important to keep an eye on how you're using any overdrafts. But if we move on to the next point, student accounts might also come with freebies, things like free rail cards, which we've obviously already spoken about, perhaps cash incentives for opening the account in the first place, perhaps cashback on purchases. It is important that you're not blinded by these incentives because sometimes they are covering up perhaps high charges, other monthly fees, which other accounts wouldn't have. But they may be, interesting for you, particularly if you are looking to get a rail card anyway, for example. And another small tip, and although you might wish to open a student bank account for the reasons we've already spoken about, you may also want to keep any existing bank account open as well, because generally the longer you've held a bank account, the better this will be for your credit rating in the future. And the better your credit rating, the better the chance of being accepted for things like mortgages in the future, if that was something you wanted to do after uni. Some student bank accounts will give you credit cards as well. And again, if used sensibly, this can be a great way to build up your credit rating, but try not to miss any repayments because that can have a detrimental effect on that credit score. So again, as we've already mentioned, might be worth setting up a direct debit if you are able to access a credit card. But finally, a final tip for anyone nearing graduation is actually to review your student account after you graduate, because at that point, you might want to shop around for graduate deals. Banks will often automatically switch student accounts to graduate accounts, but it's worth having a look at the implications of that because often student accounts with interest-free overdrafts might convert into graduate accounts where those interest-free overdrafts are reduced. So important just to be mindful of what will happen to that overdraft once you've graduated. But I'd now like to look at some of the areas of financial support you might be able to access. And just to set the scene here, really, I think it's a good idea just to call out a few findings from the 2024 Student Money Survey. This is done by Save the Student, and they actually found that over 4 in 5 worry about making ends meet. 67% of students surveyed actually skipped meals at least some of the time, and 48% have actually thought about dropping out of university due to money-related issues. And so I think the first thing it's really important to say on this slide is that you are certainly not alone if you are struggling financially or finding money management overwhelming. So with that in mind, let's look at where you can go for help with finance and debt. And first of all, it is worth taking a look at the government website I've linked here. This highlights some of the help available, so have a look on there. But one of the sections on this website is around help from your university or college, because you might be able to apply for money directly from them on top of any other student finance. And where this is the case, you don't usually have to repay grants or bursaries, but you'll only be eligible for them if you meet certain criteria. And different universities or colleges do have their own rules around bursaries, scholarships, and rewards around who qualifies, how much you can get, and how to apply. So, for example, they may be offered on the basis of a student's academic abilities, perhaps household income, sometimes a combination of both. But in general, the money could be used to help pay towards tuition fees, books, equipment, childcare, if that's relevant, travel. So, worth talking to your student support service to find out what's available. And the next point is around hardship funds. So, designed to help students who are having financial problems while studying or before arriving at university. And they may be referred to as different things depending on where you are. So, in England, you might hear them referred to as access to learning funds, financial contingency funds in Wales, support funds in Northern Ireland, discretionary funds in Scotland. But the money is usually awarded by universities to students who receive loans from student finance. They're decided on a case-by-case basis. But you can usually apply whether you're studying an undergraduate or postgraduate course on a full or part-time basis. Now, the next point is around funding from charitable trusts, and I've linked the Turn to Us website on the slide here. So, Turn to Us is a national charity. They help people financially when things do get tough. And they not only offer support themselves, but they also have a grants checker on that website as well. And if you put in a few details about your age, where you live, it shows which grants you may be able to apply for. So this is available for everybody, not just students, but might be worth having a look on there. But on the topic of charitable grants, I also want to call out that the support network offer student hardship grants for those studying mechanical engineering and are on a limited income. And similarly, the ICE Benevolent Fund support those with additional challenges through their disabled and disadvantaged student scheme. And this can provide financial support through a termly grant. So definitely worth contacting the support network or the ICE Benevolent Fund to find out more about any support provided through those channels. And there might be other organisations too, companies, networks that provide similar financial support for students in your specific field. So definitely worth looking into. But if we just finish off this slide, was looking around, I did find that Step Change have some student advice on debt. So I've included the website there, and the National Association of Student Money Advisors, so NASMA, they have advisors in many universities as well, which you can often access free of charge. So do have a look out for NASMA if you would like to chat to someone about your finances. But conscious of leaving time for questions, I'd now just like to wrap up with a few useful websites. So various student websites here, some we've referred to throughout the session, but I just wanted to bring them together on one slide so they're there for you to refer back to. And I also want to highlight that you do have access to that support through the ICE Benevolent Fund and the IMechE support network as well. So thank you for listening. Now I will hand back to Sarah and we will go to questions.
Thank you very much, Amy. A really, really useful webinar as always. So for our first question, if I'm working late at a pub, is my employer obliged to make sure that I have a way of getting home safely?
A very, very relevant question given the conversation we've just had around student jobs. Now, typically this would be covered in your contract of employment. So worth looking there to understand exactly what your particular employer's obligations are around those topics. Now, with regards to legal responsibilities, employers have a responsibility to protect your health and safety at work. But if you are concerned about getting home safely, that's probably a conversation to have with your employer. They may be able to provide additional support, considering this on a case-by-case basis. So definitely check that contract of employment first, but also don't be afraid to have a conversation with your employer to see what additional support they can provide if needed.
That's great. Thank you. Moving on. If I earn well over the summer, are my student grants going to be affected?
Another great question. So since your maintenance loan eligibility is based on household income, so that's the basis really on which you would be eligible for a maintenance loan. If you work part-time and your earnings put you above the eligibility thresholds, then there is a chance this might affect how much financial support you get. Now, you would generally need to be earning a fair bit for that to happen, but it is something that you should be mindful of. So do the research, make sure you know what those thresholds are related to any income you are getting in terms of maintenance loans, that sort of thing. And if you are worried about any part-time jobs affecting student finance, you might want to consider, say, adjusting your working hours. And of course, as we've already said, that will also help you maintain a balance between kind of work and study as well.
That's great. Thank you. And last one, if I'm an English student studying in Scotland, do I get free prescriptions?
So I've had this question before, interestingly. So one thing I would say is please make sure you're registered with the doctors in Scotland. But usually, if you're registered with a GP and you're living in Scotland, you will get prescriptions free of charge, regardless of your age and income. This usually is the case in Northern Ireland and Wales as well. But one thing I would just say to caveat that is you won't get that prescription for free if you present it for dispensing in England and didn't qualify for that exemption that we spoke about earlier. But yes, generally, if you're an English student studying in Scotland, you're registered with a GP, you've got a Scottish address, yep, you should be eligible for free prescriptions.